Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read his fiery gospel written in rows of burnished steel. As ye deal with my condemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth a trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is stamping out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him by jubilant my feet. Oh, God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make man holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Truth is marching on. Yeah. They will another ideas about philosophy, about Cicero. The English and the Americans, they are not transforming this name as Cicero, as this man was really called Marcus Tullius Cicero, of course, not Ciceron, right? So one day I was thinking that only we are transforming those names, like we are making Montesquieu out of Montesquieu and so on. It's very rare worldwide to make this Latinized version of everything, and we do even a Latinized version of Latin-speaking author. In this case, Cicero, of course. So it's really funny that we are more Latinized than the people who are representing the Latin culture. Yeah. So they will do, but who will do another video about philosophy about Cicero? Oh, you would like me to make a video about him, right? Is this what? Have I understood it right, Raimundo? Maybe better in Spanish. Quizá mejor en español. Ah, okay. You are from some Spanish-speaking country? or it's just a nickname? Tu nombre parece que me parece que tú eres de un país mm, usando el idioma español, ¿no? O portugués. What a glory, right? So now, before you will gather here, I will tell you a little bit about the American Civil War, obviously, because I am dressed as the officer from, or a cavalry soldier or officer, because in cavalry all the soldiers were wearing big hats. So it could be either officer of the regular troops or cavalry, but it varied. It wasn't a stable role. So of course of the Union of the North, the northern part of the American Civil War that was fought in the 1860s, of course. And there are many theories about the American Civil War. They are theories that it was not really about slavery. There are theories that was more about freedom. There are theories that the American war was mostly about centralization and decentralization of the government. The last part is to some extent true because those were times of the centralizing tendencies in the whole of the Western world, especially in Europe. And in those times, because we are accustomed to this type of reality, that it's the USA that is really the trendsetter of everything. Yeah, North against South. So, but it wasn't the case in the 1860s. America was, of course, gathering some strength, but it was an industrial power already only in 1880s when the war against South was already won, and the Americans have strengthened the industry and became the first industrial nation among all other nations and stronger than Germany even. So it was in 1880s, but in 1860s it wasn't. There was still problems with that because of the obvious conflict between North and South, and there were some centralizing tendencies and there were some abolitionist tendencies, and this all met in the same period of time. But you must remember that it was the time when the movement for centralization of Germany already was going on, both in a democratic parliamentary way and the militaristic approach by Bismarck and his circle. So we had these tendencies, and the same in Italy. We have Mazzini, we had Camillo Cavour, the others who were trying to unite Italy. So Abraham Lincoln was to some extent only reacting to that by trying to centralize the government. And he also wanted, of course, he was the first American president who was openly anti-slavery. That's true. So we cannot omit that. We cannot forget about the problem of slavery. So it was really a war about slavery, but it was not the only bone of contention here between North and South. The other thing was because the problem with slavery was to some extent solved, but it was solved in such a way that it could be maybe some permanent peace could be established in the normal situation when we would deal with a country that is not expanding westward. And that's not the case of the United States, of course. The United States was going from sea to shining sea, and the new territories, every new territory, even before it was transformed to another state, there was always a quarrel if slavery should be permitted in this new territory or not. So there was always quarrels like that, and this situation would probably never be solved peacefully. So what they were doing, they were only postponing the conflict. But of course, when Abraham Lincoln started to be president, he was the first candidate who was openly abolitionist. He was openly anti-slavery, and that was something new. That's true. So when the southern states, which were also dominated by the Democrats, because to this moment on, it was such a situation in the American politics that they were an American Whig party based on the Whigs from Britain, but not very similar in program. The Whig party was the party that, because at the beginning of the American political history, we had two parties: the Federalist Party, which was pro-centralistic, mercantilistic, and so on, and the Republican Democrats, which is a little bit funny, knowing what kind of parties would appear later. But at the beginning, we had only two parties: the Federalists and the Republican Democrats. The leader of the first party was Alexander Hamilton. It is still deep 18th century. It's still the last quarter of the 18th century. So, and the leader of the party of the opponents were Thomas Jefferson, the leader of Republican Democrats. So, but this political reality ended already in the first decade of the 19th century. The Republican Democrats transformed into Democrats and had to be ideologically restarted. And the Federalists totally vanished because their leader, Alexander Hamilton, was killed in the duel in the 1805. So the new parties appeared, and we have, for instance, in the 1830s, we have the Democrats, and we have which are elder, because we assume that because the Republicans are conservative and the Democrats are not, and then we assume that the Republicans probably, and they are called the Grand Old Party, but they are not older. The Democrat Party is older. Democrat or Democratic, because they were started as Democrat, but now we prefer to say Democratic. So the Democrat Party started in 1820s, 1830s, and the main opponent was in the 30s and 40s. It was American Whig Party, and it was replaced in this role by the strictly and openly abolitionistic party, which was called Republicans. So they used the other element dropped by the Democrats at the end of the 18th century. So they picked up this element, Republican, yeah, because they were only Democrats. We must remember that when a party is calling itself Republican, it means that it's thinking about the United States as the one country in every aspect. When the party is called Democrat, it stresses the need of some political system, not necessarily connected with the very unified federation. So the Democrats were very much stressing the need of keeping all those procedures that are important for democracy, and they were more local in their politics. So they were more state centered than I don't know, Washington centered, yeah, and so on. So and this was mainly the party of the local states and at the beginning already, and Democratic Party was neither, it was not the conflict of the conservative against liberal, it was more the conflict of the center against the peripheral. So so when we are speaking about the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, that they switched ideologically in the 20th century, no, it never happened, because the American policy was about center and peripheral grounds, and not about ideology so much. It was more about the system, administrative system, and so on. The first ideological moment was really not counting maybe this small contention about mercantilistic approach and free trade approach, because in the 18th century the Federalists wanted to create an industry in the northern states. They had the biggest support in the northern states, and they wanted to dominate the trade even in Europe if it's possible. And the Southerners, they wanted just to sell their crops and their food and cultivated products and cotton and so on, and they wanted just cheap merchandise, cheap clothes and things like that from Paris, from London, and so on. So they were free market oriented, but it was maybe the first ideological problem between the two parties. Then there was a problem with the expansion in the times of Andrew Jackson, the 1820s, and so on. There was an ideological problem: expansion, yes or no. So Andrew Jackson decided for yes. It was the second ideological problem in the history of United States. So when we compare the Republicans and the Democrats of the 19th century and of the 18th century, we must remember that American politics was mostly about administrative things, mostly about expansion or not, yes or not, mostly about technical things. So when Abraham Lincoln came and he was surrounded by abolitionists, that was something new, and that was not very widely understood. And yes, Abraham Lincoln was not so much convinced if black people are equal to whites, but he was more of an opinion that they are almost equal or something like that, and he was for making this distance between races smaller. He wanted to make those problems between races smaller and less significant. But he, of course, he had his superstitions also, to some extent. That was totally normal in those days. So when the BLM movement is protesting against Abraham Lincoln, they just are showing first and foremost that they don't understand history, and they don't understand the changing world view of people in the progress of time. Yeah, well, there were some writers, for instance, like Voltaire, who invested a little bit in the trade of slave trade, but he was later against it. So it wasn't so obvious for those people in both in 18th century and 19th century. The whole slave trade was a little bit different in the both of those centuries, but that's another matter. No, we shouldn't be condemning people because they thought some things are more acceptable um, than we think today, because I think the problem would appear only if they were ardent supporter, maybe, of this case of. Maybe that would be the problem, but I don't think Nietzsche never concentrated on this problem. He was not obsessed with race or something like this, contrary to what it's believed of him. Hello, Dagber. Okay, any questions? Gone with the Wind, yeah. In Gone with the Wind, Gone with the Wind, yeah. The main character, the main male character in this movie, Red Butler, is the representative of the Southern culture, and he was making the others aware in this movie, which is interesting because he is presented as some. Because usually in the historical movies we have main protagonist constructed in such a way that his vision, its world view is much broader than usually, and we have this in the case of this movie too. Red Butler is a person who has traveled north, and he knew the northern states, and he make the here in this movie, in Gone with the Wind, he's trying to explain to his southern colleagues that the in north, that all industrial power is concentrated in north, and war against south and north must be won by the north, which is funny because there were not so many voices like that during the actual conflict. And I, as historian, I know it because it was my first field of interest when I switched from biology and geography to history, and it happened in the last stage of the high school, of my high school. So the first topic that was of great interest to me, it was exactly the American Civil War. So and what is very interesting, that of course I watched Gone with the Wind several times already when I switched from biology and geography to history. And I observed that during the actual conflict, there were not so many people who really traveled across both the southern and northern states, and not so many people who were really aware of the disproportionate power, both in industry and weapons, between the south and north. So the more typical situation was that a person would probably leave his, even the educated people who knew something about the world would rather be living almost the whole life in one state, maybe traveling to neighboring states, and would react like in the other movie, far more recent movie, which is called Gods and Generals. We have one general who is a main lecturer in the Virginia Military Institute, and this person was he said that sure, I love the Union. He was Southern, so I'm using now the Southern accent. And sure, I love the Union, but I love Virginia more. Yeah. So it was far more typical character. So they are because America is such a big country, and even if most territories were not made into states yet, and still it was such a vast, huge territory that most people were thinking about themselves more as the Virginians, Marylanders, New Yorkers, and so on, right? So it was not the Dakotians and so on. Dakotians maybe not. Dakota was still a territory, I think, but you know what I mean. Texan was not Texas, which we are. Well, California was only a territory. It was not a state. It was very rarely populated, and Texas was already playing some role. It was taken from the Mexicans a little earlier in the 1840s during the U.S.-Mexican War, and Texas already meant something. But the most important states, of course, of the South was Virginia, and Virginia was punished exclusively for the rebellion by being separated, by being divided into West Virginia and Virginia. And today we have two states exactly for this reason. Should Poland abandon convention about landmines and start planting on a borderline? No, I think that we would become the public enemy of the world if we do that, and so it wouldn't be recommendable, I think. And because it would be it would mean finding some additional enemies. We don't need that. We need support. To this moment we have a vocal support of the European Union, but European Union, I mean mostly Germany, is scared because the Russians are just directly threatening to cut off the gas emissions, and not emission, but gas, natural gas, providing the national gas. So they are a little bit standoffish. Yeah. So I think that the offense that the government is planning is more than suitable for the task. It would be totally enough. Why every time a country introduces totalitarian and anti-human regulation, you justify it by saying that the country is dense and cities are close to each other? That will never end because... What do you mean totalitarian and anti-human regulations? You mean the COVID regulations? Yeah, when the country has more dense, there are exceptions from this rule. There are countries which had very little regulations because of COVID pandemic. For instance, the Netherlands have little regulations against, or very few regulations against the COVID pandemic, although the Netherlands is the most densely populated country in the whole of Europe. I think the Netherlands has something like 400 people for a square kilometer, so it's really dense. And when you have a country, for instance, because the whole idea you are mentioning, Google user, is that I had a discussion with another atheistic vlogger, and he said that he was congratulating the Austrians that they are not playing, softball with, as the Americans would say, with the people who don't want to get vaccinated, and that they are totally cut from the society, really, from using hotels for traveling to abroad and so on. And he was congratulating the Austrians for it. And I wanted to make him aware that that Austria is a country that is structurally and geographically totally different than Poland, for instance. Well, Austria is mountainous, so it means that almost half of its territory is already lost for mountains, and you cannot really you can dwell a bit in the mountains, but not really, right? So in the 18th century Switzerland, for instance, no one lived in the mountains. All people were living in the valleys. The mountains were perceived as something anti-human, dangerous, non-inviting, disinviting, really, and no one really dwelt in mountains. All people dwelt in valleys. So in the 19th century, it changed. The Romanticism movement was introduced. The mountains were perceived as something very sympathetic and interesting and climatic, and people moved to mountains. But even then, it is understandable that people cannot really dwell in huge groups on mountains, in the mountains. So even today, almost all Austrians are living on the flat terrain in the in the valleys, or in the more flattened parts of the country. So it means that only half of the country is really, well, for settlers, right? So we already have this country of maybe 80 odd thousand quadrat kilometers size. We already have only 40,000 kilometers, square kilometers size, right? I mean, the surface of Austria is really, really small. So you have a country, for instance, in comparison, Poland, which is above 300,000 square kilometers of size, is losing just a small particle of its surface for mountains. That is the terrain that couldn't be really densely populated. So Poland loses almost nothing, and Austria is losing half its size. So we already have a situation in which, realistically, you have 40,000 square kilometers in Austria for settlers, and you have almost 300,000 kilometers, because Poland is really 3,014, I think, 314,000 square kilometers, or something like that, right? So you maybe lose like 20,000 for the mountains, right? So maybe 25. So you still have almost 300 intact for settling. So Poland is far less densely populated, because of course, the Austria is only less than 9 million people is living in Austria, but still it's not a totally different level of population. So still Poland has many villages, small towns. Poland is much less. Even if you take Austria, you don't have so many smallish towns. You have more. Most of the Austrians are living in a couple of big cities like Wien, Graz, Klagenfurt, Vienna, Klagenfurt, Linz, Graz, and Salzburg, and so on. So you have totally different situation as far as crisis management is concerned, and that I am not justifying any methods how to prevent spreading the pandemic or spreading the plague, but I am merely explaining why the policy is probably different. So I am not condemning and I am not justifying anything. I am just explaining. But in Poland, it's very hard to do just that because people understand every voice as the voice for or against something. And I was merely explaining to Mr. Zenon Kalafatic, I think his family name is, that he is wrong if he thinks that you can easily compare Austria's policy towards in relation to the pandemic and Poland's. He cannot because it's a different world, and there are some examples of countries that are not applying very strict rules, although they have small territory. But for instance, Scandinavian countries, of course, except Denmark, which is constructed geographically in a total different way, and it's not really Scandinavian anymore. It's Scandinavian only in this sense that it's still possessing Greenland, where nobody really dwells, and used to have Norway as part of its territory. So it's only in this respect it's Scandinavian, and Denmark is pretty small. And but all the three biggies of the Scandinavian peninsula, namely Norway, Sweden, and Finland, they all have very loose and liberal policy in relation to the pandemic because of its size and not very dense population, of course. So we can be comparing our situation to Sweden's situation, because even if Sweden is slightly bigger than Poland, almost all Swedes are living in the southern half of the country, of Londa landet. Right, so the oval country, as the Swedes are calling the country. Right, so I was merely explaining the difference. I did not hear what happened to Mr. Jablonowski. No. What happened to Mr. Jablonowski? He was arrested? Probably he was thinking he was making such idiotic comments about Russia and Belarus that it was high time to get him arrested, or not. PSL is losing its credibility and also its territorial support. It's not even clear. Maybe I know that it was said many times before about PSL that maybe they will not get enough votes to get into the parliament, but I think this time they really can be outside the parliament. The numbers are very, very low for them. I think that I will not read the book of Marcin Rola Rzymierski, or how its name is, because he's just not. It's just not tempting enough for me. It's a person of very, very, very narrow views. When I study, for instance, Mr. Ziemkiewicz's books, they are at least interesting. They are interesting even if I don't agree with him. With Marcin Rola, I well, he's just too stupid to be tempted to read his books. He's just what he's saying. It's just the series of national slogans. He's not really thinking of his own. He's not an independent thinker. He's not a thinker at all, I think. So, yeah, Ziemkiewicz is a different level, like 5 times better writer than and political analysts. I doubt if we can call Mr. Rolla a political analyst. He's not analyzing anything. He's just spitting out some slogans, and that's more or less all about him. So Komorowski is more one of the, well, not counting the situation in which he introduced an alternative to the Independence March, and nobody came except for his bodyguards and staff. Maybe that was the cock up, but notwithstanding, he's a very realistic politician in a strict contrast to the rest of the Platforma Obywatelska civic platform. He's realistic in this way that he thinks that the only chance to winning against Law and Order Party, Law and Justice Party, is his thinking is correct, but he will not be listened to, I think. The solution of the Belarusian border crisis is precisely searching for support in the European Union, not pressing the Germans too hard, because the Germans are already blackmailed because of the natural gas delivery. So we shouldn't be pressing Germans too hard. We should be content with what we have, because we must remember that when the sanctions on Russia were introduced, it was precisely Germany and Poland working together. Yeah, that's possible. That sometimes happens. Poland and Germany together wanted to have sanctions on Russia. The Netherlands also wanted, because their plane was shut down, right? We remember that. So they were furious too on Russians. But all the southern countries in which we are traditionally so in love with, like Italy and Spain and so on, they were all against sanctions on Russia. They all thought they were unnecessary. So we cannot push the Germans too hard. We must be content with what we have. Elliot, you didn't tell me what happened with Jablonowski. So Hume's History of England, yes, it's very much worth reading. It was even in the at the end of the 19th century, it was, and it's still read today. Even at the end of the 19th century, it's still a manual for. It was still a handbook um, for the students of history at the English universities. Yes, it's definitely a very good book. The only problem with the history of England by Hume is just that it ends with the Glorious Revolution, so it's not encompassing 18th century. Yeah, Jablonowski, if he was, and I can presume that he was saying the same idiocies which were said by Korwin Mikke, and knowing Mr. Jablonowski, he was probably saying more or less the same, even if and probably in a much more aggressive version, with much more aggressive style. And he's not a representative. He's not a member of parliament, and Mikke is. So yeah, Jablonowski had it coming when he was, because what Mikke, for instance, is saying about Belarus, it's also, for me, it's also high treason. But what do I know? Answer to everything. Yeah, Stupid people very often have this illusion that they can give a good answer, good solution to everything. And Marcin Rolla is not an exception. Why did he burn the statue of Kalisz? Well, the suburbs of big cities, they revolt very often in France. It's part of their culture. It's also encouraged to some extent by the culture of being supportive of protests and marches and so on. The French are usually, when they don't know exactly what the protest is about, they usually sympathize with the protesters. The only exception are maybe the rich people or people who are working in the offices in the center of Paris, for instance, and they cannot, because of the protests, they cannot really go in the direction they plan to go, for instance, to work or from work, and then they can maybe be an exception. But the France is, because France, the modern France, is a creation of the protests, which is, of course, the march to Bastille in during the first French Revolution, at the beginning of the French Revolution. The French, if they are not really aware of what is going on exactly, which is the normal state of any people in the street in any country, they usually assume that this protest is worthwhile and has some real issue to be organized about, and they sympathize with it. So this kind of attitude towards protests makes the protesters more eager to protest, and that's why you have so many riots and protests and marches in France always, because the culture is sympathetic with them. It's not, for instance, it's totally the other way around in Germany, and it has something to do. For instance, Germany, not only Germany, it and has much to and it has much to do with the historic fact that all reforms and corrections of the German political system were introduced from above and not from the people. So, for a German, maybe with the exception of the ecology movement, the green movement, any protests, seems to be a little bit suspicious or unnecessary. And for the French, is just the other way around. So there are always some tensions in the suburbs. There are always some protests in France. They are very easily triggered too. For instance, I remember when I was in Paris, and whenever it was a problem with the gates to metro, when you pushed the small tokens to the machine that would allow you to go to the train. Whenever it was jammed or had some other technical difficulties, people got angry very, very easily and very fast. And it was, I couldn't imagine Germans or any other northern Germanic or Slavic Europeans reacting in this way. So I see the potential. And I also heard that there were some studies which big cities on the face of the earth are the cities of most stressed people, and Paris was always in the top 10, even sometimes even second or third, after Hong Kong, for instance, because Hong Kong is the most densely populated city in the whole world, probably, or one of the maybe Macau is even more, but Macau is not really a big city. But from the big cities, Hong Kong, because they couldn't really reach much out of Kowloon Peninsula, right? So they had to be growing in very close frames. Yeah, I know the Statute of Kalish was about equal roles for Jews. It was introduced in the 12th century by the, as far as I remember, by the local prince of Kalish, and it was made national by Casimir the Great in the 14th century. Yeah. Yeah, Jablonowski is, yes, he had many anti-Semite outbursts. Oh, on which march? On the March of Independence? Really? Oh, I didn't hear that. This is very funny that when and it was released, highlighted by one of you during our conversations, the previous one, or maybe no, it was in the comments below my film about the March for Independence of Poland. So there was a comment that somebody pointed out that it was usual in during the reign of Civic Platform during their administration that the police used a number of provocations against the people, the participant of the march, and they were stressed and they were provoked and they behaved in a totally different manner than today. And now it's much better, maybe with the exception when the march was almost stalled by Trzaskowski during the pandemic, using the arguments for fighting with the pandemic. So but in our time it's better. But I don't know. Was Jablonowski saying those things during the Independence March or later or independently of the march? About the protests in France, I can presume that it could be something about the problem with high rent because Paris is becoming a very unaffordable city for people with modest income, and it's often the case for people who are doing simple manual work like Algerians and Malians, les Maliens, les Algériens, and so on. So it was during the march. I've read maybe 100 books in Italian. Is this many? I don't know. Maybe 80, maybe not 100, maybe 80. They were mostly about 18th century Venice. Sometimes they had passages also written in Veneto. Veneto is the dialect which was used in Venice in even in 18th century that stopped in the 19th century, stopped to be used. And for instance, very funny thing that the greatest author in the 18th century, Italian author in the 18th century, was never coined a phrase in the real Italian, almost never, because I mean, of course, Carlo Goldoni, the great playwright, the great Venetian playwright. And Carlo Goldoni was, of course, writing in Veneto. Veneto is very different from the regular Italian, which is basically from Tuscany, and the literary Italian. That the dialect of Tuscany is used as the base of the modern Italian, because it was during the Trecento and Quattrocento, during the early Renaissance period. It was used mostly by the authors like not Dante, even earlier, but then Boccaccio and then Tasso and so on. But in the 18th century, the most prolific area for playwrights and other authors was Venice, and the author like Carlo Gozzi and Carlo Goldoni and the others were they were writing mostly in Veneto. And Carlo Goldoni in the 1760s, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 1700s, in the early 1760s, he moved to Paris, and he was writing in French, of course, from this moment on, which is very funny because the greatest author in Italian history, the greatest playwright in Italian history, which is Carlo Goldoni, was never really writing in Italian. He was writing in Veneto. Veneto is more similar to Spanish, and Spanish was helping me more with Veneto than my knowledge of Italian, although I know Italian a little bit better than Spanish. I like Spanish a little bit more than Italian, but I still speak Italian a little bit better than and understand than Spanish. And but it's a fun thing because I also read a number of plays by Carlo Goldoni, which were in the regular Italian, which is Tuscanian, really. So it's funny because I was reading Carlo Goldoni in the language in which it was not written, not even, as far as I know. Maybe with the exception because he has written like 40 plays. Maybe one or two was translated to Tuscanian, but I'm not sure. But it's funny that I was reading Mirandolina, for instance, La Locandiera, and so on, in the regular Italian, which is Tuscanian, in which Goldoni has never written. So, but I also read a pretty big amount of big number of books about the Italian history and so on. Che appearing in the every fucking line. Yeah. It's sometimes it's not so clear what they mean. Yeah, but I mostly try to understand it from the context. Yeah. I know that in Brussels one day, Lech Kaczynski and Donald Tusk, they were having a few laughs about the possibility of uniting peace and PO rally. Yeah, it was mostly in as a joke, I think. But they joked about it, and they said that they would have like really many like total dominance on the political scene. But I think it wouldn't be recommendable for those parties to unite at any point, even if they in the period when their programs were not so much far from each other, because if civic platform and law and justice would unite, that would probably encourage different parties to create some really stronghold against them both. And when they are dominating the scene as the conflicting sides, then probably their dominance is more developed than in the alternative reality in which they would be united. Because if they would be united, they would introduce some policy that would be for some people controversial, and the possibility of creating the other party and really giving some floor for the other party, like 30% of votes party, this level of political strength, then it would be possible. And now it's impossible, because we are perceiving all what is happening in the politics of Poland through the lens of the conflict between civic platform and law and justice party, which does not mean that I think that they are playing this conflict. No, they are not playing. They are real emotions, real Smolensk emotions, real abortion emotions. This is all real, but they have much more dominance combined over the whole political scene than they would have to than they would have to than they had if that they would have had they were um, united, had they united. Sorry, problems with this form. Yeah, I have a small migraine, so it's not helping. Also, with concentration of those forms. Uh, so I think the day in which the PO and PIS would really unite, the next day we would have a strong Social Democrat Party, for instance, Social Democratic Party, or something like that. What tendencies caused that the European armies had so many thinkers and scientists in the 18th century? European armies had so many thinkers, scientists? If I understand you correctly, you mean that you probably make a note to my observation that 18th century European armies were something like laboratory of the historic period, right? So, like NASA is, for instance, today, or ESA, or uh, Russian space agencies, and so on. That the many people who were playing the most important roles in the 18th century culture had something to do with army, and some also with diplomacy. Think about when we think about the 18th century philosophers as people who are similar to intelligentsia of our times, which is mostly anti-militaristic, very much always on the side of the weaker, pacifist, and so on and so on. We must think again. It was not typical in 18th century For instance, Voltaire wanted to be a diplomat. He wanted to be a historiographer for the king, Louis XV. Yes, but he also wanted to be diplomat. Rousseau, despite his being so very antisocial, really, in many situations, he was a secretary to a diplomat. And there's many interesting people had something to do with ministries, like Goethe was a minister for the government of the Sachsen-Weimar Principality. So the the whole idea of being there always for the weak and for peace and so on, it's something which is more about 19th century intelligentsia or 20th century intelligentsia than about 18th century philosophers. 18th century philosophers were usually they valued strength and resoluteness, and they valued energy and power and strength. So it's not strange that most of the philosophers had little sympathy, if any, little sympathy for falling Poland, and Poland being divided into three pieces by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. We got some signs of sympathy from Rousseau, who was basically insane and had his real strong problems with his psychology, and from Edmund Burke, who was by no means typical thinker, because he was one of the founders of the modern conservatism. So he was not a typical philosopher of the Enlightenment. So most of the intellectuals, so to speak, because the intellectual as the layer of people, as the social strata, was constructed really in the 18th century. The people who are reading as many books as possible on various topics, trying to figure out the real condition of the world. This type of intellectual was born in 18th century, yes, but it does not mean that they were so much counter-cultural as the intelligentsia of the 19th century. They were not. They wanted more liberty, they wanted more tolerance, yes, but usually in frames of what already existed, in frames of the monarchies with their administration, with their armies, with the diplomatic service, and so on. And they all very often wanted to have piece of that, and they wanted to, I mean, in the positive sense, and they wanted to play some role in it. So there were many interesting thinkers in the 19th century who occupied some position in army, in diplomacy, and so on. So they were thinking in the way the politicians think, more than they were thinking in the way of some dissentier or some people who were against the government, maybe always against all governments or against war as principle, which is more typical for the intellectuals of our times. Which by the way, I am not a typical example, because I am more an 18th century intellectual than 20th century intellectual. I am usually sympathizing with the government, not with the weak, not with the ruled, but with the ruling. And I will tell you why. Because ruling is very, very hard. It's very hard to make people satisfied, to satisfy all those needs and interests of different strata of the society. And what is opposition doing? Well, opposition only have to figure out how to criticize in a productive manner. That's all. They don't have to figure out so many difficult things. And this approach is more 18th century intellectual than the typical intellectual of the 20th century or the 21st century is more that they would like to rule, but and they are frustrated that they are not ruling. They would like to be politicians themselves, and they sympathize with other people who are criticizing the governments or the governments in different countries, totally avoiding the simple fact that ruling is so very hard and complicated. So yeah, so the role of intellectual, the attitude typical for intellectuals, this all changed during the course of time. Yeah. And I am more representing the 18th century way of thinking with for obvious reasons, because I'm so much in it, and as a researcher and author and historian and so on. Well, the opposition in Poland is automatically an enemy, not because it is by definition so, and it wasn't before, because when, for instance, let's take the last change in the government. So when Civic Platform, the Platforma Obywatelska, lost power, was voted out, and Law and Justice secured their power and position. The first 2 years of the MPs for Platforma Obywatelska were going like they concentrated first and foremost on criticizing the 500 plus program. So they wanted to convince the population that the 500 plus program is doomed to fail and is doomed to cause some significant economical problems. So the problem with that is that they were criticizing the 500 plus program for 2 years and trying to say, you see, the economy is crumbling. And when it wasn't so, and when the reality proved that their approach is that their reading of the situation is false, that nothing of this kind is happening, that Polish economy is doing fine, maybe the best economy in Europe after maybe Austria, Holland, Germany, and so on, is then they changed their approach. They have said that they proposed simply 700 plus program. They didn't want to appear stingy. They wanted to be seen as more generous, notwithstanding the fact that they were criticizing the too much spending for the people by the government for 2 years. So they were totally inconsistent. But those two first attempts to to crush the government, to destroy the government destroy the peace government, destroy the Law and Justice Party government, was totally democratic. It was not unsuccessful, but it was democratic. All this whining for the last 2 years about the crisis of democracy and rule of law in Poland. That it's this is something that it could really be seen as sometimes as a treason, and only then uh, peace pushed the agenda, that it's pushed this vision that they are really traitors. So it wasn't so Jovita. It wasn't at the beginning like that. At the beginning, we had a normal opposition, democratic government, democratic opposition. But when they quarreled against, they when they started to quarrel about the rule of law, about the judges, and when the Platforma Obywatelska was started to imagine different things and trying to persuade the other European countries that in Poland several things happened that never happened, like the LGBT free zones and things like that, which never existed. Then we are for the last 2 years in this conundrum that we are feeling that it's impossible for Poland to have a normal government side and normal opposition. But we had this 2 years ago. Yeah, I am using Dr. Google, of course. Google. Yeah, I think almost everybody uses Google now, which has some drawbacks because Google is really highlighting the progressive sites and progressive um, progressive websites, progressive results than conservative results. So it's a little bit biased. I think that the virus will stay with us, unfortunately, and will form some different kind of flu. This type of viruses that are spread in the air are almost impossible to really eradicate. You cannot do much about them. What we can do is, well, try to be more resistant, to take care of our health, because we will be confronted with this virus. Yes, the China solution was not the best because they have this Delta variant, and it's they have a very dramatic situation right now. So in China, the Chinese have halved their economy in they totally slaughtered their economy, which is not often mentioned because people usually avoid saying negative stuff about China because there are so many Chinese companies in all the countries now, and people are thinking maybe I will one day work in one or for one, and then maybe I will avoid. But the only countries that really managed the situation were, so it's not the truth. I remove the comment which is not saying truth, although it states that it's saying truth. Um the only countries that really managed the situation in with flying colors is, of course, Taiwan and South Korea. Those are the countries which really managed this pandemic well. And this is first and foremost for the disciplined society that was cooperating with the government. So something that is not happening neither in China nor in Europe, because in Europe people want to have their liberty more than they would like to have their health, and in China people were passive, and they are not really trusting the government. The government is just doing what it wants with people. So also not a very good situation in. So I would say that both China and Europe and the US and India and Brazil failed against the pandemic. The only good notes I would have for West Australia, only West Australia, and not the eastern part, because there are two different policies, and of course Taiwan and South Korea. Ah, you mean browser? Okay, yes, Firefox, yes. The favorite season of what? Ah, favorite season. You mean the of the year? I mean favorite season. I thought this question was referred to some TV series. Yeah, favorite season. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. I used to like winter the most, but it changed. No, I don't think it would be so bad as you say, Levita. I think the virus, notwithstanding those very dangerous variants like Delta and so on, I think basically the virus will become more mild in the next months and years, and will form another type of entertainment for us, just as winter and autumn and or the Americans say falls and winters type of entertainment like Flu is providing us with. Yeah. Okay, so I think the energy in this in our today's conference is a little bit spent, and this of course will be this whole conversation will be of course accessible on the community site, right? So you will have the direct access to it in spite of the period of rendering, right? Because every video that is longer than 16 minutes, I think, has to be rendered, and it's not appearing automatically to all users, to all viewers, and to have the to make you to provide you with the opportunity to having this access. I am putting always the Q and A's just and as we finish. I put the link on the community site. So okay, so no more questions. So I retire, and I wish you all the good end of the day. Bon fin de soirée, as the French say. Take care.